Hey, praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. And again, Jesus returned into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised abroad that he was in the house. And straightway there were gathered unto him great multitudes, insomuch so that there was not room to receive them, no, not even so much at the door. And he preached the gospel unto them. Then they brought one unto him, lying in the bed, sick of a palsy, born of 4. And when they could not get to where Jesus was, because the press was great, behold, they uncovered the roof to where he was. And when they had broken it up, they let him down through the roof unto where Jesus was. And when Jesus, looking on them, saw their faith, he said unto the sick, palsy lying in the bed, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. All right, so here we see Jesus continuing his mission. So as we see, we're in Capernaum. We just came from Galilee. We saw where he told, that, sick of the leprosy, not to go out and publicize his name. So we just saw where, he told, the leprous man, the man with leprosy, not to go and publish it abroad, but rather to just go to the priest and show himself and offer for the, offering the gift that Moses commanded. But instead, he went to publish it, and Jesus could no longer enter into the city, but he was out in a desert place and they had to come unto him. So overall, in this, we see Jesus's compassion again, just like the last one, when he had compassion, on the guy that had the leprosy. But here we see him, exercising one of his great, abilities that he was given, because we see him here, forgiving sins, being the Son of God. He doesn't get catalog that we get. He gets a different one. We know that he has the power to lay down his life and take it up again. Now we're seeing here the power to forgive sins. And we know that he said this, just so that people, this was for the people. He actually said it, that so that you guys will know that, the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins. When you guys hear it, you guys are gonna think it's blasphemy. But I'm sure if I was to sit down and talk to you and reason through with you about, things that God himself is allowed to say, I'm sure you wouldn't mind saying that he is, of a mind to say, thy sins be forgiven thee. But just because you can't accept that I am he, then you will say it's blasphemy. If you guys say it, it's blasphemy. But when I say it, it's within my, God-given status to forgive sins here. And we know that the sick of, of the palsy, that he was born, of 4 with this. Palsy in those days, referred to paralysis. Maybe he has cerebral palsy. Those guys, they're rigid. Their muscles and joints, is contracted. They can't really move their limbs, much. So it wasn't because of sin that he was like this, because he was healed when Jesus said, thy sins be forgiven thee. Leaving you to imply that, because that would be the most logical connection that you would make, that because of somebody's sin that he was like this. But no, it's so you guys could know that I have the power to forgive sins. Just like the man who was born blind, when the disciples asked him, who did sin? This his mother or father, or even him, that he was born blind. Jesus said, neither was it because the mother or the father sinned, but this was done, to reveal the glory of God. All right. So let's get into these scriptures. So it starts out saying, and Jesus again returned to Capernaum after some time, and it was noised abroad that he was inside the house. So the last time he was in Capernaum, he started and he did his thing. So word got out where he went. He cast out devils. He healed the sick, and he preached the gospel. So he returned here, and whatever house he was in, it didn't really say. We know that he just came from Simon Peter's house, where he lived with his brother Andrew. Yeah, that's when he got up early in the morning to go pray, and they couldn't find him. And then when they found him, he took them, to other cities to preach the gospel. So the second time when he was returned to Capernaum, we're seeing right now. So a little thing has been established. The fame of him is here, because it said that it was noised abroad. So when they saw him, they started to say, "Oh no, Jesus is here." And they started each one tell one, he's here. Spread the word, Jesus is here. Whatever sickness anybody has, he's here. Bring them onto him. A state of emergency, just like a APB. Like when the cops, they'll pull out a all points bulletin for some emergency. There a suspect somewhere, or some accident or whatever happened. There's a incident of interest. So it was noised abroad. They use this specific language to convey exactly what it sounds like. Like I said, the last leper, he told them not to go and spread it, because Jesus, then he couldn't even enter the city. There were so many people. But now that he's in the city, it was okay for it to be noised abroad, because now they could come to him. Because remember, he had to go to a desert place, and that's the difference. He came here. That's the difference, because when this, man with leprosy went and he voiced it abroad, then the people, they were gathered together at the gate, the entry of the city. So he could not even get past them to get in the city. But now, he came up here, without warning. So he was able to walk through without them anticipating him coming. So now that he was here, they began to blaze it abroad. He's here, gather everybody. And that's exactly what they did. So pay attention to the language. And that's why I always say, make sure you keep the King James or the New King James. Don't go to any of those, new translations, new international, any of these other things, because, a lot of, the meaning is lost. Specific words, because we have people, interpreting, these scriptures into modern language that they themselves don't even fully understand it. I can guarantee you one thing, that if somebody, they don't understand, what it's saying, and I guarantee you that the interpretation that they're gonna give is gonna be wrong. So stick to your New King James, stick to your King James, because it said here, and it was noised abroad that he was in the house. So then the next scripture it says, and straightway great multitudes were gathered unto him, so much so that there was not even room enough to receive them, not even at the door. And he preached the gospel unto them. So many people came. It says that not even the door there was room. Picture them, because as we're about to see, he's actually inside the house. Using listening to this language, you would be tempted to interpret that he was at the door, and that's where they came onto him. But he was actually inside the house, and the whole place was crowded. The door was packed, the sides of the house, the inside, the walls of the house on the outside and the walls on the inside. It was just covered with people, and they were all there, for each one for their own reason. I'm pretty sure that, some people who got healed, they came back. It was such an experience for them. They wanted to see him again. Not so much more for a healing, but to hear what he had to say. Because, if this man can do something like this for me, I want to hear what else he is saying. And he's, here preaching unto them. And straight away, it said, they wasted no time. There's a striking contrast to be appreciated, when the man of God of this day, comes in a certain place. There's not a great gathering to receive him, like this was. Because, this was believers and non-believers, heathens, Samaritans, Jews, everybody came. If a man of God were to go preach somewhere, yeah, he might get a small following, or even a good enough following, but that will only be of believers. I guarantee you it's not going to be like this, where everybody is coming. So just appreciate that, comparison. So straightway, this wasn't I'll be there later in 5 minutes, or let me finish, washing the dishes. They didn't have dishes those days. Let me finish, whatever I'm doing, washing clothes, let me finish, what I'm doing at the market. Let me, everybody dropped everything and they came straightway. It said great multitudes were gathered unto him. Jesus, he had this effect on people. Remember the woman by the well, the one that had 5 husbands, and he said unto her, the one that thou hast is somebody else's husband. It's not even yours right now. She went and she gathered the whole city unto him. So there was not room enough to receive them, not even at the door. The whole place was packed. And it says, and he preached the gospel unto them. So, with this many people, it's going to be hard to establish order. Maybe being in the desert place was a better idea when you look at this, scenario, because I imagine it's going to be hard to get them to stop talking, pay attention. It's going to be hard because everybody's going to be asking, what they want. He's in the house preaching. How are the people outside going to hear what he's saying? They didn't have speakers in those days. Was he also healing while preaching? Here it just said that he preached the gospel unto them. This is really a great moment, because if you think about it, like something that's this emotionally charged is going to have a lasting effect on someone. They're going to remember everything he said, what it meant. They're going to carry it with them. It's going to become a part of them. Even if they, choose to ignore it, choose to not listen to that still small voice, reminding them, it makes, like I said, compare this, what's going on right now. There's not even room to receive him, them at the door. And everybody's there to hear him. Compare that to how they started saying, crucify him. Did something happen? How did we go from this, to saying crucify him? Did he do anything unto them? Remember, the only person, or the only people he really ever rebuked was the scribes and Pharisees. And they were a limited number compared to the whole multitude of people. So how did, like I said, at the Last Supper, when the devil entered into Judas after Jesus dipped and gave salt, the devil, he entered into the whole atmosphere. That's why he's called the prince of the power of the air. And he entered into everyone. And that's how you go from, this, such, revere, such respect, such anticipation, such, being enthralled and enraptured, by, this man, Jesus, to saying, crucify him, give us Barabbas. Barabbas can heal you guys, leprosy. He can cast out your devils. You got to understand that there was something supernatural happening right here. And then the next scripture, it says, and they came unto him, bringing one lying in the bed, sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. So a lot of people came there for healing. It doesn't really, he always did heal all of them, but there's no commentary, made on that aspect, seen right here. But then we see it cut, directly to these men. They're carrying their friend, or was it their, brother? Because he was male. It did say he was a male. born of 4 children. He was one of four. And somehow he was unlucky to be the one that had the palsy. If you'll notice, they got there kind of late because, they were outside and they couldn't get not even close to the door. But the door was packed. The inside and, outside the house was packed. And they were kind of like, maybe in the outer parts of the crowd or maybe in the middle part of the outer part. Because remember, they had to carry this man. So they had a disadvantage compared to everyone else. Even though it was maybe many of them carrying him, but it's still going to be a little slower than everybody else. We don't know what was, the situation when they got there to him. Maybe, somebody got there and told him, and maybe he didn't want to come at first, or maybe he did want to go. Was there a delay in him getting there or making up his mind? But here he is being brought, by his friends, and the story, it cuts the focus on him. Was there others like this that maybe would have happened? Maybe, don't, discount that maybe there was also somebody else, but, this one was so much more charged that, this one was mentioned and not the other one. So this one is mentioned, and then it goes to say, and when they could not get to where Jesus was because the press was great, they uncovered the roof where he was. And when, they had broken it up, they let down him lying in the bed, sick of the palsy. So they're trying to get inside. Hopefully people will see him in the bed and, they'll give him, priority. Just like, in America where we have, handicap parking. Handicap parking is usually, closer to the venue so that, you don't have to walk as far. And, not anybody, unless you have a special permit, you can't just park there. When you go on a bus, if there's an old person, an old lady, they'll ask you, hey, give your seat, up to the elderly. It's like, when they saw them bringing this guy in the bed, they were hoping that people would let them through and give them priority. But that wasn't the case. There was way too much. And like I said, with this kind of, excitement, people were maybe even forgetting, they were even forgetting, things like this, They were just so enthralled with seeing him. They didn't even notice that they could still, give, place to somebody like this. Not out of disrespect or out of spite or malice, but just they were just so captivated. So they didn't give up. A lot of people, judging from this, experience, some people will come onto God for something. Yeah, then they will get it. They don't get it the first time, and then, they get discouraged and maybe give up. But not these guys. They went, and that's why this one is mentioned, and maybe, not another one. Because who would think, to take apart the roof of the house? I want to ask this question too. Whose house was that? It obviously wasn't theirs, right? I mean, can you imagine somebody coming and tearing, the covering off your roof? So much so that they're able to let somebody through it. No, there's no way that they would have known so that they could see to stop them because they were probably inside the house also, right? Because, they were there with him first, before the people even started, gathering. So when they would have seen it was when, there was the big hole, and now they're letting this guy down. In another interpretation, it said they let him down by a cord in the mattress, in the bed. So imagine you sitting in your house and, you look up because, it was probably noisy. So it's not like, they could hear, or maybe they did hear something, tapping on the roof. But then you look up and look, you can see the sun and there's a big hole in your roof. What are the chances that, they left a leak? Whenever it would rain, then, that part of the roof would leak always, because of that. So, these guys, they got creative. They got creative and they let down, this guy. It says they could not get to him because the press was great. There were so many people. This was the kind of crowd where you couldn't, squeeze your way through because, I mean, the gate called, the pool of Siloam where, the angel troubled the waters. And it came to pass whosoever was the first to step into the water after the angel touched it, they were healed of everything. So, and it said a host impotent folk, they next to that pool. This might have been in a different location, but, you expect that there's going to be also hosts of impotent folk, in this, Capernaum also. How many of them were gathered unto him? So, you can just, picture the excitement and anticipation in these guys. When they got the news that he was there, they were excited, them walking, they were probably speaking about it on the way over there. Saying, man, I can't wait for him to heal me. I can't wait, And they were just, so excited and encouraging each other and just, speaking good vibes and, positivity and just excitement. So when they saw that, it was blocked, they didn't give up. I wonder if was it his idea to go in through the roof or was it somebody else's? It probably, was somebody else's because, being in having the palsy, being paralyzed, you don't really get to move around to, experience, physical motion on an everyday, for you to be able to calculate, that, hey, I am able to go up on the roof. You kind of just like get stuck one place and, mastering concepts of, position is not something that a person like this would have done, being, paralyzed like this. So it says that, then they, uncovered the roof where he was. So, those houses back in those days, they were probably not all that big, depending on how rich you were. But remember that this thing, it was packed. So how could they see, exactly where he was in the house? Well, somehow they figured it out, because it says that they uncovered the roof to where he was, and when they began to break it apart, so they not only uncovered it, they had to break through it. So this was a multi-layered structure. So they uncovered it, and broke through it. And something like this is gonna interrupt everything. Something like this is gonna stop everything. When the woman with the issue of blood touched him, everything stopped. He said, "Who touched me?" Everybody stopped talking. They said, you see the multitude touching thee. You ask, "Who touched thee?" Imagine him, speaking whatever he was doing. Then we see sunlight in this house. We look out. There's a big hole. Then he stops. He looks up, and then so he sees them letting this person down, in the mattress, to him. And then as soon as Jesus saw it, he could see their excitement. He could see their hope. They're expecting it to change. And them, getting them, doing this. It probably, it touched him. Really, it did. He said, "Son, be of good cheer. Thy sins be forgiven thee." Now, so far, this is the first time we've seen him say this. So far he said, "Be thou cleansed, be thou made whole, I will." But this right here, you can see it struck a chord in him that maybe even he forgot, where he was and what he was doing. He had a outer body experience. In this moment, he probably even sat on the throne of heaven when he saw them. He said, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." Because, think about it, why would he just say this to them and not to other people? I believe, seeing what was going through their mind, and the fact that they had broken through the roof just to get to him, it touched him so much. It was like an out of body experience. I say it put him back on the throne, and he spoke like he was on the throne. No, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. I am Straw Greenhorn.